Could be with personal belongings. It's worth a look, I guess.
And to go on the second floor.
What? No, get back!
Dead Space 3 is a game that was made by developers and released. It's an attempt at horror just as much as Resident Evil 6 is. A big part due to EA being EA and trying to rake in on the over-the-shoulder cover shooter craze of the early 2010s, adding ridiculous amounts of microtransactions to a single-player game, and in turn preventing the devs from making a worthy successor to the series. As a result, instead of a natural continuation, we got a game that nearly killed off Dead Space forever. Thankfully, the recent remake is a great sign for things to come, unless EA repeats the same mistake again, but that's a different topic. That's actually badass. Is there anything up there?
No, nothing.
Okay. It's clear a lot of care was put into the graphics, models, and some of the physics. The environments usually look fantastic, the alien city and Tau Volantis being obvious highlights. Some of the areas though just don't really fit into the world. Dead Space 2 had quite a lot of color and variety of locations, but it all still felt like Dead Space and made sense in the context of a space station. Meanwhile, the whole opening section in the city feels like a different game, in part due to the constant action and fights against humans, but also just the overall atmosphere. The layouts also just don't make sense sometimes. Like there's a ridiculous number of elevators and ladders everywhere. Yes, elevators are a big part of Dead Space, but here is just overdone, especially elevators with jump scares in them. You're constantly in an elevator, on a ladder, or wasting time getting to the next area in some other way. It gets extremely tedious by the end, both in terms of gameplay and immersion. I just don't understand why developers still think, to this day, that constantly standing in elevators or crawling through tight spaces adds anything to the game apart from tedium.
We just decimated him.
Man, why does it feel so good to step on people? The horror aspect is practically non-existent, with constant over-the-top set pieces with no time to breathe in between, making the whole game quite exhausting, and not in a good way. You can see the game attempt horror or just jump scare you sometimes, but all of it falls flat on its face, making it that much more disappointing. These issues are even more prevalent when playing in co-op, as it's inherently harder to make a game scary when more than one person is involved.
Yeah. Love it.
Who's that?
Oh, hi! Yo, your Skype is lagging.
What? The sound design is pretty much the same as the previous games, but just less impactful as a result of being an action game. The guns sound good, but you just shoot them so much that they lose their effect much faster than in 1 and 2. The game also just feels generally too loud because of how much is going on constantly, so not only is it hard on the eyes, but also grating on the ears. How fun. The music is extremely generic and unmemorable. Because of the focus on action, it sounds like any other third-person shooter. The only good tracks are the ones returning from the previous games. The music is used haphazardly, and there are multiple times where the intense music just wouldn't stop even when nothing was going on. Despite the presentation and sound design being quite close to Dead Space 2, a much better game in every regard, it's not as effective and actually pretty grating in 3 because you can just see this is not the game the developers wanted to make.
Oh, I found Elijah Mack. You got them. Get back.
Shit!
Get back. Get back. Damn it.
While mechanically, it's mostly like the previous game, as I've said before, the execution is what ruins this game's potential. There are so many small issues or missteps that add up really quickly to make quite an unsatisfying gameplay loop. In my opinion, the game's biggest thing when it comes to gameplay is universal ammo. Right from the get-go, it makes resource management practically non-existent, especially because of the large inventory space. In turn, it ruins any chances of the game feeling like survival horror. Universal ammo is even worse than it sounds because it seeps into every other aspect of gameplay and worsens it. To diminish resource management even more, you now get about 15,000 medkits every room you go through. So is there any scarcity of ammo, medkits, or even crafting resources? No. The only scarce resource in this game is the desire to play through it. There is no shop either, as the only thing you can do now is customize your weapons on a bench and change suits. The developers also made the animations just long enough to become annoying.
Alright, let's look at this baby. Oh my.
Jeez, that's like the meme quadruple shotgun, you know, from Doom. The customization itself is the best and worst part of the game at the same time. You can see the developers spent a lot of time to ensure there's a huge variety of gun combinations. Some of them get pretty ridiculous too, which is genuinely fun. What's not fun is the resources you have to collect and the ridiculous amount of microtransactions. Yeah, this is EA we're talking about. You can't not expect ridiculous DLC here and there. But this is some of the most blatant and worthless DLC, and EA is known for worthless DLC. Yeah, I just have a line rack now and double. How does this work? Oh, you need to hold it, I think. I'm so confused. What? While Dead Space 2 improved the looting, stomping of enemies, and general movement, 3 utterly botched it. The stomp itself is the most satisfying in the series, but everything I've mentioned and the sheer amount of stuff the necromorphs drop make it feel all the more like your average looter shooter. The addition of rolls and covering add absolutely nothing to the gameplay, except for taking the game even further away from its roots. The game takes control from the player ridiculously often, with forced rappelling sections on top of all the time you already waste with other traversing segments. The game really has all the worst trends of AAA design. Let's see this.
Okay, I got
Mom
some.
said it's my turn on the Xbox.
This actually looks scarier than all the necromorphs we've met at this point.
The puzzles are equally as uninteresting as the rest of the mechanics. I'm not asking for anything like Silent Hill puzzles, but for the love of God, at least let me use my brain a little bit. These are some of the worst and most repetitive sequences I've ever experienced. Who's calling me? Are you serious?
This makes this whole thing even better. I'm out of ammo.
I got a plasma cutter.
I have it too though.
Man, the plasma cutter is always good. Okay.
And all this is happening while I have this Discord ringtone sound.
The level design of Dead Space 2 was linear, but had tons of creative set pieces and well-paced horror and action elements. Dead Space 1 feels like RE4, mostly linear with some optional backtracking for extra rewards and completions. The main path in Dead Space 3 is entirely linear, to the point of straight up reusing areas, or at least it feels like it because everything blends together. Most encounters boil down to enemy spam in waves, making the fights drag out longer than you want. All the interesting enemy types also become redundant with all the resources you constantly collect. It gets especially bad during fights against humans, as that's where the gameplay becomes especially mind-numbing. The bad level design is most noticeable in the horrible optional missions, most of which are straight up nearly identical, with the exact same encounters for the exact same rewards. Unfortunately for us, when we played the game, we did every optional mission, and I can attest that it's somehow even more poorly designed than the main game.
Isaac Clarke, great to meet you.
Who are these guys?
Buckle, Marker Ops. This here is Jennifer Santos.
These are expandable characters, I guess.
Expendable
They're gonna
characters.
die.
I really don't have much to say about the story, because I think it's awful, overly dramatic, and none of the characters hooked me in the slightest. The only redeeming parts are the hallucination scenes that differ depending on the perspective you're playing from, which for the first time in the game actually employs co-op as a narrative tool. but they also feel a bit lackluster as not much is done with them after the first few times, just like everything else in this game. It's a shame too, as some of the world building is really interesting, especially the last few chapters of the game in the alien city. But it's utterly ruined by the lack of any character development or intriguing plot lines in the main story. Fucking babies. Typical afternoon killing babies.
That's like the only thing you can do in space. Kill the space babies. A dream job otherwise. What's happening with your phone messages?
To keep it brief, this game deserves its infamous reputation. While you can have fun with a friend, especially with the weapon combinations, the game ultimately tries to prevent any fun at every step of the way. With its lackluster story, gameplay, music, and an utter lack of anything that feels like Dead Space, EA successfully killed one of the most promising franchises in survival horror for over a decade. If a Dead Space 3 remake ever happens, there's plenty of potential for a solid horror game with some of this game's ideas. But I'd much rather get a new entry.
Fuck off.